sense to them that there's a problem, but we really don't know if there's a problem or not. We've heard the sponsoring member describe that there is a problem and that it's manifesting itself in many different ways. The question that always occurs to me next is, does the problem need fixing? And let me explain that. Sometimes we do discover things, but you find out that they affect, 1% of the population. And at that point, I think it's responsible to say, well, what kind of a program are we going to develop, or how much money are we going to spend if it's affecting 1% of the population? Is there another way to go about this? So I would agree that there is a problem. And I would want a bit more investigation about how many people this is affecting. But I think it's reasonable, even on the benefit of the doubt, to give it to the sponsoring member and say, okay, yes, it needs fixing. Next question is, would legislation fix it? Possibly. And then, of course, the last question is, would this legislation fix it? And I have a problem with what is being proposed as the solution in this Act. It's because essentially the solution that is being prescribed is to collect personal information from any individual that comes in with scrap metal that is going to be accepted by either a depot or a scrap metal dealer. And so I listened to the member describing this, and he said that this legislation would detect and deter. But in fact, there's nothing in the legislation that does that. What it's doing is, you could argue, a prophylactic action in that it is taking personal information and hanging on to it. So if there does prove to be a problem, they could track down an individual and supposedly turn them over to the authorities to pursue it from there. But there's actually no other action that is prescribed in this legislation except for collecting personal information. Now, we have 3 acts in Canada that cover the collection of personal information. The FOIP Act, which covers government and the public bodies. The PIPA Act, which is the Made in Alberta version for those companies and organizations that are not government but operate in the province and do collect in some way personal information. And then you have PIPEDA, which is the federal version of that. And anyone that was operating across provincial boundaries would also fall under PIPEDA. And it is possible for different parts of your business to be subject to different acts, depending on what you're doing. So when I read the legislation that is here, clearly it's intending, and what it's doing is, it says requirements. A scrap metal dealer, I'm sorry, I'm under 3 sub 2. A scrap metal dealer or recycler who purchases or receives scrap metal shall obtain and record information respecting the transaction prescribed by the regulation. Now, the obvious question is, what kind of information? Well, it's pretty clear as you work your way through the rest of it is they're looking for personal information. Well, personal information is exactly what the law has set out to protect. And there has to be good reason. And the concept of consent is very important, because there's all kinds of business transactions that go on, but it's about an individual saying, yes, I'm going to give you my personal information, I agree and I consent to give it to you, and we agree between myself and you how you're going to use it and who you're going to disclose it to. And there are a few exceptions in all 3 of those acts I described about the circumstances under which it can be used and disclosed without the person's consent. But generally speaking, the intent is with consent. Well, there's no consent that's being contemplated by this legislation. So it does say that it that they shall inform the person entering into the transaction that the information obtained under this section is being collected. So they're informing them, but they're not asking consent. They're just saying, I'm going to take this information and it may be handed over to the police. But it's not asking for consent, and I think that's a problem here. And that it may be provided to a peace officer or a law enforcement agency. And further, that the recycler or dealer has to hang on to this personal information for a minimum of 1 year after the transactions. So aside from it can be quite onerous to set up a system in which you can properly collect people's personal information, hang on to it in a way, because you're now responsible, and everything in the PIPA Act says you're responsible for that personal information. So if you're going to put it on a disk and give it to a private company that's supposed to hang on to this for you, and they somehow, leave it in the back alley or mail it out to their grandmother or whatever, you're responsible. That scrap metal dealer or recycler is responsible for that personal information. So you are asking them to now engage in a whole process they may not have been involved with at all, except for if they had employees, I suppose. So then the rest of the Act is really about how the law enforcement can come in and take information and go about their business with it. And if people won't do it willingly, I'm assuming the scrap metal dealer won't do it willingly, then they can compel them to do it through the use of court orders, and that's all laid out in the legislation as well. So I thought, well, maybe there's a way. How do you deal with a situation where consent is sort of implied here, but it's not sought, and it's not particularly given, and it's not really a choice. If this person, if you're going to give them or sell them your scrap metal, you're going to have to give them your personal information. Is that fair? Well, when I look at the PIPA Act, it actually speaks exactly to that point, and it says an organization shall not, as a condition of supplying a product or service, require an individual to consent to the collection, use, or disclosure of personal information about an individual beyond what is necessary to provide the product or service. And any scrap metal dealer or recycler now, if you went to them, what you're doing is saying, I can write you a receipt. I received so many tons of this from you. There's a receipt. What's your name? Maybe put your name on the receipt. But they're not requiring any more additional personally identifying information at this point. So I think this is a problem for the purposes of this Act. I understand what the member is trying to get at. I understand what problem he's trying to fix. I don't think this is the fix. Because the Act, the PIPA Act specifically, the purpose of this Act is to govern the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information by organizations in a manner that recognizes both the right of an individual to have his or her personal information protected and the need of the organizations to collect, use, or disclose personal information for the purposes that are reasonable. But nothing in Act 205, in Bill 205, is talking about how they are going to work with the collection, use, and disclosure of that. There's nothing in here that spells out how it's to be kept in a secure place or any of the other kinds of rules that you would expect to have when someone was collecting personally identifying information, essentially without their consent. Because I would argue saying, if you're going to sell this to me, the only way I'll take it is if I get all your personally identifying information. I don't think that's much of a choice. The other relevant parts of the PIPA Act that I picked up under Section 6.1, Policies and Practices, an organization must develop and follow policies and practices that are reasonable for the organization to meet the obligations under this Act, in other words, the PIPA Act. So the PIPA Act is quite clear to businesses that they have to develop a whole protocol to do with this. So all of a sudden we've said to a small business person, a scrap collector or a recycler, okay, not only are you trying to get on with business now and all the other red tape and licenses and such and so on that you you have to do as a small business person, but you're now going to have to develop this whole other protocol around the collection, use, and disclosure of this personal information that you're now collecting. And I really wonder how willing these scrap metal dealers and recyclers are going to be to have to develop this whole protocol, which the member and I just finished sitting together, or are still sitting together on the FOIP Act review, and it can be an onerous task. So thank you for allowing me to